The summer heat in Los Angeles was unrelenting, turning every surface into a smoldering oven. The pool shimmered in the backyard like an invitation I couldn't resist. My iced lemonade in hand, I sank into the lounge chair, hoping to disappear into the lazy rhythm of the afternoon. That peace lasted all of 5 minutes. The gate clattered open, and I looked up. My son, Jack, strode in with his best friend, Tyler, following close behind. Jack called out, "Hey, Mom. Got someone crashing for the summer." His voice was light, carefree. But it wasn't his voice that caught my attention, it was Tyler. Tall, broad-shouldered, and sun-kissed from the California rays, Tyler's presence hit like a sudden jolt of energy. His grin was casual, but his eyes weren't. They scanned the yard before landing on me. For a second, too long to ignore, his gaze lingered, direct, curious, and anything but boyish. "Mrs. Walker," Tyler said, his voice smooth and confident. "Thanks for letting me stay." I waved it off, though my stomach flipped. "It's Lorna." "Mrs. Walker makes me sound ancient." Tyler chuckled, settling his bag on the patio. "You don't look ancient." My cheeks flushed, and I pretended the sun was the reason. Jack rolled his eyes and slapped Tyler's shoulder. "Dude, help me with this stuff." The boys headed inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts, or so I thought. Moments later, I heard Tyler's footsteps returning. He leaned against the patio door, watching me. "You ever swim in this heat?" he asked, tilting his head toward the pool. "Sometimes," I replied, avoiding his eyes. "You should. It'd be a waste not to." It wasn't the words, it was how he said them. Tyler's confidence had a way of making everything sound like a dare. My pulse quickened, but I brushed it off. By the time dinner rolled around, the house was alive with movement. Jack and Tyler had commandeered the living room, their laughter echoing through the walls. I tried to stay busy in the kitchen, but Tyler had a knack for showing up wherever I was. At one point, I turned from the stove and nearly collided with him. He didn't flinch, didn't step back. Just stood there, too close, his blue eyes locking onto mine. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone low, almost teasing. "No, I'm fine," I said quickly, sidestepping him. My heart raced for reasons I didn't want to admit. Later that evening, as the boys played video games, I sat on the patio, the darkness offering a moment of solace. But then the sliding door opened, and there he was again. "You like being out here alone?" he asked, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "Sometimes," I said, gripping my drink tighter. "I get that." Tyler leaned back, his gaze fixed on me. "Sometimes, people forget what it's like to just stop and notice things." His words hung in the air, heavy with something I couldn't name. I stood abruptly. I should head inside. But as I walked past him, I felt it, a faint, lingering pull. I didn't look back. The kitchen was chaos. Plates clattered, the fridge door slammed shut, and Jack's voice boomed as he yelled for someone to grab the hot sauce. Tyler was already there, leaning casually against the counter, stirring his drink with one hand while scrolling on his phone with the other. His movements were unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. Dinner was loud, with Jack cracking jokes about everything and nothing and Tyler chiming in with his own quick wit. But my focus wasn't on the conversation. It was on him. On the way his hand gripped the glass of whiskey, loose, confident, like it was an extension of him. On the way his eyes moved, catching every shift in the room, and how his smile lingered just a second too long when he looked my way. I barely touched my food. My fork scraped the plate as I moved things around, pretending to listen to Jack ramble about some summer concert. But my attention kept drifting back to Tyler, to the subtle ease in his posture, to the way he met my gaze like he knew something I didn't. "You're quiet tonight, Mom," Jack said, snapping me out of my thoughts. I blinked, forcing a smile. "Just tired, sweetie. Long day." Tyler smirked into his glass, like he saw right through me. When dinner was over, Jack announced he was heading to a friend's house to pick up something he'd forgotten. Don't wait up, he said, grabbing his keys. Wait, you're leaving? I asked too quickly. Yeah, just for a bit. Tyler's staying, though. Don't worry, I won't let him raid the fridge. Jack laughed as he disappeared through the front door. The silence hit harder than I expected. Tyler stayed at the table, swirling the whiskey in his glass, the ice clinking softly. I started clearing the plates, hoping the movement would calm my racing mind. You don't have to do that, he said, standing and walking over to me. His voice was low, smooth. Too smooth. I don't mind, I muttered, keeping my eyes on the dishes. He stepped closer, reaching for a plate on the counter. His arm brushed against mine, and it felt deliberate, too deliberate. I froze, the sound of running water filling the tense air between us. You're really not like I pictured, he said suddenly. I frowned, looking up at him. What's that supposed to mean? You look more like Jack's sister than his mom. His eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. My breath hitched. I wasn't sure if I should laugh it off or walk away. But I didn't do either. Instead, I stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, my pulse hammering in my ears. Thanks, I guess, I said finally, my voice shaky. It's not just a compliment, he said, stepping even closer. His tone had shifted, deeper now, more direct. You don't seem old enough to be tied to someone like, he trailed off, glancing toward the empty dining room. Like who? I challenged, though my voice betrayed me. Your husband, he said simply, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. I turned away, my face burning. You should probably get some sleep. It's late. But I felt him behind me, close enough that the heat of his presence made my skin prickle. You sure? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. My hands were trembling as I turned off the faucet, but when I finally turned around, he was gone, slipping back into the living room like nothing had happened. The house was dark and silent, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to will my thoughts into submission, but it was useless. My mind was a carousel, and every turn brought me back to Tyler. His voice, the way he'd stood too close, the unspoken tension between us. I tossed and turned, pulling the blanket tighter, then kicking it off altogether. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 12:34 a.m. My husband, Michael, was snoring softly beside me, oblivious to my restlessness. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like footsteps on the hardwood floor. My body stiffened. I sat up, listening. Another soft sound, coming from downstairs. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Michael, and padded down the hall. My heartbeat quickened as I descended the stairs, the dim glow of the pool lights outside casting eerie shadows on the walls. The kitchen was empty, but a glass sat on the counter, condensation pooling beneath it. Tyler? I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I turned, and that's when I noticed it, a faint sliver of light spilling out from under the guest room door. My heart jumped into my throat. I shouldn't check. I should go back to bed. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, before I could stop myself, I pushed it open. Tyler was sitting on the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his phone in his hand. His head snapped up when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice low, rough around the edges. I shook my head, my throat too dry to respond. The air felt charged, the kind of tension you could almost taste. He set his phone down and stood, his movements slow and deliberate. My pulse pounded in my ears as he closed the space between us, stopping just short of too close. You feel it too, don't you? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. What are you talking about? I managed, though the tremble in my voice betrayed me. His hand reached out, brushing against my wrist. This. Us. You can't pretend it's not there. I yanked my hand back like I'd been burned, but the warmth of his touch lingered. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. "You're imagining things," I said, trying to sound firm. "Am I?" His eyes bore into mine, unrelenting. I took a shaky step back, then another, until I was out of the room. I turned and fled down the hallway, my footsteps quick and quiet on the carpet. By the time I reached my bedroom, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely close the door behind me. Sliding back into bed, I lay there staring at the dark ceiling, Tyler's words echoing in my head. My skin still tingled where his hand had touched mine, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't extinguish the fire that had ignited inside me. The next morning, I told myself I'd stay composed. Whatever had happened last night, I would bury it, lock it away, and move on like it never happened. But the moment I stepped outside into the backyard, I knew Tyler had other plans. He was already there by the pool, leaning back on a lounge chair like he owned the place. His shirt was off, his toned body catching the sun, and he held a smoothie in one hand, his phone in the other. He didn't even bother looking up as I approached, but I felt the weight of his presence like a spotlight. I tried to ignore him. I grabbed a towel, adjusted my sunglasses, and lowered myself onto the lounge chair beside him, deliberately facing away. I was determined to pretend he didn't exist. But Tyler wasn't the kind to let that slide. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, smooth. "Morning," I replied flatly, not turning my head. "Sleep well?" The edge in his tone was unmistakable. I clenched my jaw, keeping my eyes on my phone. "Fine." The silence stretched, but it wasn't comfortable. I could feel him watching me, waiting. Finally, he stood, and I heard the splash of water as he dove into the pool. For a moment, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. But then I saw him out of the corner of my eye, surfacing near my chair. "Come in," he said, slicking his wet hair back. "I'm fine here," I muttered. But Tyler wasn't asking. Before I could react, he reached up and plucked the sunglasses from my face. "Hey," I snapped, sitting up as he grinned, holding them just out of reach. "You look better without them," he said, his voice teasing but loaded. "Give them back," I said through gritted teeth, standing and reaching for them. "Come in the pool and I will." I froze, the challenge hanging between us. My heart raced, partly from anger and partly from the way his gaze pinned me in place. "You're acting ridiculous," I said, turning away and sitting back down. His laughter echoed behind me, low and infuriating. "Suit yourself." He tossed the sunglasses back onto my chair and swam away, but the damage was done. My pulse was hammering, and I hated how much my body betrayed me. The rest of the day was no better. Tyler made himself impossible to ignore. When I moved to the kitchen to make lunch, he was suddenly there, brushing past me to grab a drink from the fridge. His hand lingered on my lower back for a split second, too long to be innocent. "Excuse me," I said sharply, stepping aside. "Sorry," he murmured, his tone anything but apologetic. By the afternoon, I was so tense I thought I might snap. Every glance, every accidental touch, every smirk felt like a test, and I hated that I wasn't passing. My body reacted in ways I couldn't control, and the shame of it burned in my chest. That night, I locked myself in my bedroom. Michael was working late again, which was both a relief and a curse. I didn't have to explain why I was so on edge, but I was alone with my thoughts, and that was almost worse. I tried to distract myself with TV, scrolling aimlessly through Netflix, but nothing held my attention. My mind kept circling back to Tyler, his voice, his smile, the way he looked at me like he knew exactly what I was feeling. Then my phone buzzed and my stomach dropped. It was him. "You're afraid, aren't you?" The words were simple, but they hit like a punch. My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling. I wanted to respond. I wanted to tell him to stop, to leave me alone. But a part of me didn't want him to stop. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. My heart raced, my breath shallow. He knew exactly what he was doing, and it terrified me how easily he could get under my skin. I set the phone down, my chest tight, my head spinning. I wouldn't reply. I couldn't. But as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. Because he was right. The party was everything I needed to drown out my swirling thoughts. At least, that's what I told myself. Laughter, clinking glasses, music thumping through the walls. The neighbors had pulled out all the stops, turning their backyard into a full-blown summer bash. Strands of fairy lights hung in the trees, bottles of wine flowed freely, and the warm night buzzed with energy. I sipped my drink, trying to blend into the crowd, to disappear in the sea of conversations and strangers. Michael was still at work, no surprise there, and Jack had gone out with friends. I figured I could stay here for a couple of hours, exchange pleasantries, and head home unnoticed. But then I felt it, that presence. I didn't have to turn around to know he was there. My skin prickled, and my pulse quickened. Didn't expect to see you here. Tyler's voice murmured just behind me, low and close to my ear. I tensed but didn't move. It's a neighbor's party. Why wouldn't I be here? I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. He chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. Relax, Lorna. You look like you're ready to bolt. I turned to face him, and there he was, standing far too close. His button-down shirt was slightly open at the collar, his sleeves rolled up, and his smile was maddeningly calm. The string lights above cast shadows across his face, making his blue eyes gleam in the dim glow. I'm fine, I lied, gripping my wine glass like it was a lifeline. You don't seem fine, he said, leaning in, his voice barely audible over the music. Come on, let's get out of here. My breath hitched. What are you talking about? I can't just leave. Why not? His fingers brushed against mine, light as a whisper, but enough to send a jolt through me. No one will notice. I should have walked away. I should have said no. But I stood frozen as his hand slid into mine, his fingers intertwining with mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. Tyler, I can't. You can. He cut me off, his voice steady, coaxing. Before I could think it through, he was leading me through the crowd. My heart pounded in my chest as we slipped past the clusters of laughing neighbors, through the sliding glass doors, and into the quiet, shadowed hallway of the house. The noise of the party faded behind us, replaced by the deafening sound of my own breathing. The hallway was dim, the light from the backyard barely reaching us. Tyler turned to face me, his hand still gripping mine. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice trembling. Because I can't stop, he admitted, his words raw, unguarded. And neither can you. I opened my mouth to protest, but he was already stepping closer, his other hand brushing my cheek. His touch was electric, igniting something in me I'd tried so hard to bury. And then his lips were on mine, soft but urgent, like he'd been holding back for far too long. My body moved before my mind could catch up, leaning into him, letting the kiss deepen. It was reckless, impulsive, and everything I knew I shouldn't want, but I did. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer as the world blurred around us. My heart raced, my head spun, and for a moment, there was nothing else. Just him. But then it all came crashing down. Mom. The voice sliced through the haze like a knife. I froze, my lips still brushing against Tyler's, my mind scrambling to process what I'd just heard. Mom? Are you here? Jack's voice came again, closer this time, filled with confusion and disbelief. I shoved Tyler away, panic flooding every inch of my body. Tyler stumbled back, his eyes wide, but neither of us spoke. Jack's footsteps echoed in the hallway, and I turned to see him standing a few feet away, his face a mixture of shock and horror. Jack, my voice faltered. There were no words that could fix this. His eyes darted between me and Tyler, realization dawning on his face. What the hell is going on? He demanded, his voice shaking. Jack, it's not what it looks like. I stammered, though even I didn't believe the words. He stared at me, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. "Are you serious, Mom?" he spat. "With him?" "My friend." Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but Jack cut him off. "Don't. Just don't." His voice cracked, and he turned, storming out of the house without another word. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, my chest heaving, my mind racing. Tyler stepped toward me, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Just go." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and disappeared back into the party. I sank against the wall, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me. My son had seen us, and there was no taking it back. The moment Jack stormed out, my world splintered. I stood in the dim hallway, my breath ragged, my thoughts a tangled mess. My hands trembled as I wiped my lips, trying to erase what had just happened, but the heat of Tyler's kiss lingered. From the other room, the muffled noise of the party went on, oblivious to the disaster unfolding in my chest. I forced myself to move, to steady my breathing. I went to the bathroom and stared into the mirror, gripping the sink so tightly my knuckles turned white. My reflection was a stranger. Flushed cheeks, wide, panicked eyes. "What have you done?" I whispered to myself. Downstairs, the front door creaked open and slammed shut again. My heart lurched. Tyler must have followed Jack. My stomach twisted. What would he say? What if Jack told someone? What if he told Michael? I splashed cold water on my face, my mind racing with every horrible possibility. The secrets I'd kept, the lines I'd crossed, it was all unraveling, and there was no stopping it now. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jack's face, the disbelief, the betrayal. Michael came home late, as usual, muttering a tired hey before collapsing into bed. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. The next morning, the house felt suffocating. I lingered in the bedroom, hoping to avoid both Jack and Tyler. But eventually I had to face them. When I stepped into the kitchen, Tyler was already there. He stood at the counter, pouring himself coffee, casual as ever. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his hair messy in a way that looked effortless. He turned as I entered, and his eyes locked onto mine. The smile that spread across his face was slow, deliberate, and maddeningly confident. "Morning," he said, his tone light, but his gaze held a challenge. I ignored him, moving to the fridge to busy myself. My hands shook as I reached for the orange juice. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my back. The silence stretched until Jack walked in. His presence was a thunderclap, shattering the fragile calm. His hair was unkempt, his face pale, but his jaw was set in a way that made my chest ache. "Morning, Mom," he said curtly, barely looking at me. "Morning," I managed, my voice barely audible. Jack didn't sit. He grabbed a granola bar from the counter and turned to leave, but not before casting a cold, pointed glance at Tyler. Tyler met his stare, unflinching, his smirk still lingering. "Got somewhere to be?" Tyler asked, his tone dripping with faux innocence. Jack froze, his hand tightening around the granola bar. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he just shook his head and stormed out of the room. The tension was unbearable. "What are you doing?" I hissed at Tyler once Jack was gone. "Having coffee," he said, leaning casually against the counter. "You're making this worse." "Am I?" He tilted his head, his eyes daring me to argue. Before I could respond, Michael walked in, his tie slightly crooked and his expression tired. "Morning," he said, glancing between us. "Morning," I said quickly, turning back to the fridge. Tyler didn't say anything, but I could feel the weight of his smirk even as he moved to the table. Michael paused, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "I'm fine," I said too quickly, forcing a smile. Michael didn't look convinced, but he let it go, grabbing his coffee and heading out the door. As the day went on, the walls of the house seemed to close in. Jack avoided me entirely, his door shut tight. Tyler, on the other hand, made himself impossible to ignore. Every glance, every smirk, every casual brush past me was deliberate, calculated. By the time the afternoon sun dipped low, I felt like I was going to explode. I locked myself in the bathroom, standing in front of the mirror again. This time, I couldn't even recognize myself. My eyes were tired, shadowed with guilt. My lips still burned from a kiss I couldn't forget. My hands gripped the edge of the sink as I leaned forward, my breathing shallow. "What have you done?" I whispered again, tears welling up. I thought of Jack, of the hurt in his eyes, the way he couldn't even look at me. I thought of Michael, who was oblivious but wouldn't stay that way for long. And then I thought of Tyler, his smirk, his confidence, his maddening ability to get under my skin. I had destroyed everything. By late afternoon, the tension in the house was unbearable. Every glance Tyler threw my way felt like a deliberate test. Every step I took felt like walking a tightrope. I'd barely spoken to Jack all day. He locked himself in his room, his silence screaming louder than words. And Michael was supposed to be at work late, like always. But then the front door opened earlier than expected, and Michael's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. My heart sank. I was standing in the kitchen when he walked in, his tie loosened, and his face a mask of weariness. But something was different. His usual distracted air was replaced by a sharpness in his eyes, a focus that made my stomach twist. "You're home early," I said, forcing a smile. My voice came out too high-pitched, too unnatural. "Things wrapped up faster than I thought," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. His eyes scanned me, lingering for a moment too long. "You okay? You look tense." "I'm fine," I lied, turning back to the sink, scrubbing an already clean plate. Before Michael could ask more questions, Tyler strolled in from the backyard, shirtless, his skin glistening from the pool. He moved with the kind of ease that made me want to scream. "Hey, Mr. Walker," Tyler said casually, grabbing a bottle of water from the counter. "Didn't know you'd be home this early." Michael gave him a nod, his expression unreadable. Tyler, meanwhile, didn't miss a beat. As he leaned over the counter to twist the bottle open, his hand brushed mine, just a fleeting touch, but deliberate. My body tensed, and I pulled away, praying Michael hadn't noticed. But he had. Michael's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting between us. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone flat but edged with suspicion. "Of course," I said too quickly, my cheeks burning. Tyler, unfazed, took a long sip of water, his smirk barely hidden. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of suffocating tension. Tyler continued his subtle provocations, an innocent laugh that lingered too long, a touch on my shoulder as he passed by. Jack stayed upstairs, his silence adding to the oppressive weight hanging over the house. And Michael, he watched everything. By the time dinner rolled around, I could feel the cracks widening. Michael barely touched his food, his eyes constantly flicking to me, then to Tyler. My hands shook as I set down my fork, my appetite long gone. "Lorna," Michael said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Yes. You've been acting strange lately," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Is there something going on?" The room felt like it was spinning. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled for an answer. I don't know what you mean," I stammered. Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. "You're jumpy, distant. And now, you can barely look me in the eye. So, I'll ask again, what's going on?" Before I could respond, Tyler appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. His presence was like a spark to a powder keg. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes were locked on mine. Michael's had snapped toward him, his jaw tightening. The tension in the room was suffocating, the silence stretching into something unbearable. "What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his tone icy. Tyler shrugged, completely unfazed. Just checking in. The way he said it, so casual, so smug, made my blood run cold. I could feel Michael's suspicion solidifying, his gaze now sharp and accusing. Tyler, I said quickly, my voice trembling. Why don't you go upstairs? But he didn't move. He stayed where he was, his eyes still on me, daring me to say more. Michael stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his voice rising. My mind raced, my chest tightening with panic. One word, one wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. But as I looked at Michael, his anger, his confusion, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of the years we'd spent drifting apart, the countless nights I'd spent alone, the way he'd stopped seeing me. And then I looked at Tyler, his confidence, his defiance, and I realized something that terrified me. I didn't want to save this. Lorna, Michael said, his voice low and dangerous. Tell me the truth. Right now. I opened my mouth, the words on the tip of my tongue. But before I could speak, Jack's voice rang out from the top of the stairs. Maybe you should ask Tyler, he said, his tone cold and bitter. All the blood drained from my face as Jack stepped into view, his eyes burning with anger. Tyler's smirk faltered for the first time, and Michael turned to me, his expression a mix of rage and betrayal. The room was a pressure cooker, seconds away from exploding. The tension in the kitchen was suffocating, every second dragging out like an eternity. Michael's eyes were locked on mine, blazing with a fury I'd never seen before. Tyler stood frozen in the doorway, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. And Jack, standing at the top of the stairs, his voice cold and biting, sent a chill through the room. Ask Tyler, Jack repeated, his words cutting like a knife. Jack, I started, my voice trembling, but Michael cut me off. No, he said, his tone low and dangerous. I'm asking you, Lorna. What's going on? I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight. My thoughts scrambled. This was it. The moment everything came crashing down. I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, there was a knock at the front door. The sound sliced through the tension like a whip. Everyone froze. Michael's brow furrowed, his head snapping toward the door. Who the hell is that? Nobody moved. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. I'll get it, Michael said, his voice sharp. No, Tyler interjected, stepping forward. I'll. Sit down, Michael barked, his command so forceful that Tyler actually stopped in his tracks. Michael strode toward the door, his shoulders tense, his fists clenched at his sides. I exchanged a panicked glance with Tyler, who looked as pale as I felt. Jack stood frozen on the stairs, watching everything unfold with a mix of anger and confusion. The knock came again, and Michael yanked the door open. And then he froze. We all did. Standing in the doorway was a woman, a striking brunette in her late 30s, her hair perfectly styled, her expression calm and confident. She held a briefcase in one hand and an envelope in the other. Michael Walker? She asked, her voice smooth and professional. Yes, he said, his voice tight. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we need to have a conversation, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes swept the room, lingering on each of us. Who are you? I managed to ask, my voice shaking. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes.
I'm Daniel Hart.
Michael's attorney. The air left the room. My stomach dropped, my mind spinning. Attorney? Jack asked from the stairs, his voice full of confusion. Michael didn't even glance at him. He exhaled slowly, his expression hardening, and for the first time all night, he looked calm. Thank you for coming, Danielle, Michael said, his tone cold and measured. I think it's time we set a few things straight. He turned to face me, his eyes sharp and calculating. Lorna, he said, his voice steady now, almost detached. We're going to talk. All of us. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Danielle placed the envelope on the counter, her movements deliberate, her eyes flicking between me, Tyler, and Jack. "You might want to sit down for this," she said, her tone polite but firm. And just like that, the ground shifted beneath me.